what I say to you this morning, brothers and sisters, is that you don't have to know or understand everything to start living faithfully today. And there's a lot of great stories in history about brave men and women who have served God through faith. And those are really some of my favorite kind of stories. I like reading about them. I like listening to them. I like watching them in movies and television. And one of my all-time favorite stories about an ordinary man, his extraordinary God, is that of Army veteran Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss, as you can see on the screen behind me, was born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, into a family that deeply valued faith. His upbringing was marked by a strong commitment to Christian beliefs, influenced heavily by his King James Bible. As a young boy, Doss took the Ten Commandments very, very seriously, particularly the Sixth Commandment, which says in the King James, "Thou shalt not kill." And this belief became foundational to his faith and his life choices. One of the more traumatic experiences for Doss in his life is that when he was little, him and his brother were play fighting, and they ended up playing a little bit too rough, and he seriously injured his older brother and almost killed him. And this event never left Doss, it never left his mind, and it made him even more determined to avoid violence in his life. Now, when the Japanese attacked American Seoul at Pearl Harbor, Doss felt a strong sense of duty, like many Americans at the time, to serve his country. Now, despite Doss's conviction against violence, he believed that he could still serve as a medic and save lives. However, a man at the time enlisting with a commitment to not carry a weapon was highly unusual, and his superiors and fellow soldiers struggled to understand why he was doing what he was doing. Doss's basic training, as you can see behind me, was incredibly challenging, but it wasn't just the physical demands that was challenging for him about his basic training. The hardest thing for Doss that was hard about his basic training was the ridicule and the abuse that he endured from his peers. Many soldiers mocked him for his beliefs, calling him weak and unpatriotic, and they would even poke fun at his faith. And they would snatch his Bible from his hand, and they would mock his belief in God, his refusal to carry a weapon, and they would question his loyalty and his manhood. Even his superior officers attempted to discharge him because they saw Doss as a liability. But through every trial, Doss clung to his faith and his convictions. He found strength in prayer and in the Bible that he carried with him everywhere that he went. Now, despite all of the bullying that Doss went through, he always treated other men with kindness and with respect. Doss's faith shone the brightest on the battlefield during the Battle of Okinawa at Hacksaw Ridge. As his battalion faced relentless enemy fire, many soldiers were wounded and left stranded on the battlefield while the other men retreated back down the cliff. So what Doss did is, instead of retreating with the other men, he stayed behind, unarmed and alone, to rescue the injured. So what Doss did is he found some ropes, and you can see up there in the picture behind me, he tied them in these loops, and what he would do is he would put the rope loops underneath their arms, and then he would grab the rope, and then he would gently lower them down the cliff, which people who have been there have said was about 400 feet high. And he did this one by one. and he prayed each time a prayer that became his mantra for the night. He would say, "Lord, help me save one more." Now, when the soldiers were being lowered off the cliff, his superior officers had no idea who was doing this. And so once they got the men and they took them back to safety in the medical tent, they would ask the men that he brought back down, they said, "How did you get down off this cliff? Who saved you?" And what the men told them is that Desmond Doss, in fact, was not dead. He was very much alive, and he was up there saving the wounded men that unfortunately had to be left behind. Doss's absolute favorite story from his account of this night is that he came across a man who believed he had gone blind. Now, for those of us like me who have never in the battle, I'm like, why would that be something you would worry about? But what often happens in battle is that men can have these just huge damages and injuries that happen to them. And this even happens for people who are EMTs who work with car wrecks. Every now and then, people will survive things that they probably shouldn't have survived in all actuality. And so some things that would happen is people could lose limbs, somehow still survive from it. I know the actor actually who played Scotty in Star Trek, he lost his middle finger on his left hand during the Battle of D-Day. Just kind of some interesting fun fact for you guys. But what happened to one of the men that Desmond Doss came across is that man believed he had gone blind, and he must have thought that some kind of debris or a grenade went off and just hit him directly in the eyes. But what Desmond Doss saw when he saw that man is it wasn't that this man was missing his eyes or anything like that. The man actually just simply had mud on him. But he was so scared that he thought he had gone blind. So what Desmond Doss did is he got his canteen out from his pocket and he poured it over the man's eyes. And he said the look on that man's face is one that he will never forget. The man just kept praising God that he now could see. This small act reflected Doss's compassion and care for each man that he saved. Not just for providing physical rescue, but Doss also provided hope and comfort to the men there that night. And throughout the entire night, Doss ended up saving 75 souls. And many of those men were some of the very same ones who had bullied him earlier. Doss has this to say about the event, and I'm going to read this word for word here to make sure I quote him correctly. He said, "I was praying the whole time. I just kept praying, Lord, help me get one more, until no one was left, and then I came down." Well, of course, the men were so impressed by Doss's genuine faith and bravery that they waited 15 minutes before going into the final battle so that Doss could pray for them. For Doss's incredible bravery beyond the call of duty, Desmond Doss received the first Medal of Honor to be given to a conscientious objector by President Truman. You see, Doss may have been an ordinary man, but he had an extraordinary God. His story is one of unshakable faith and courage. His prayer, "Lord, help me save one more," became a mission, a reflection of Christ's love. He showed that true strength lies in standing by one's convictions and acting on your faith with integrity. Doss's story sure does give us some powerful things to reflect on, doesn't it? So, as I thought back in this story, I came up with 4 things that I learned from this story, and I think that this will apply to all of our lives today. The first lesson that we can learn from Doss is to live faithfully with conviction. First blank on your outline this morning, to live faithfully with conviction. And by conviction, I mean a firmly held belief, not a conviction of a crime, for those who are wondering. Now, in other words, what I'm saying is that everything we do must be done in faith. For example, in the first century church, there was a group of Christians that believed it was a sin to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Now, while Paul actually did say that it was not a sin, let's take a look at Romans 14:23, what Paul had to say about it, though. He said that if you do anything that you believe is not right, you are sinning. Now, if those Christians truly believed that eating meat sacrificed to idols was a sin, but let's say they did it anyways because all of their friends at church were doing it at the potluck meal afterwards, for example. Even though Paul says that objectively it's not a sin to eat meat sacrificed to idols, according to this verse up here, it still actually would have been a sin for those Christians to eat that meat. And why? Because it was not done in faith. Like in our story this morning, Desmond Doss's decision to serve as a medic and not carry a weapon was rooted in the conviction that this was God's calling for him. So for Doss, going against this conviction actually would have been a failure to live by faith. And the point of me bringing it up this morning, brothers and sisters, is not to be controversial. That is not my goal at all. What I'm trying to be for you this morning is to be encouraging. Because after all, everyone in this room, I'm sure, don't we all at least have one conviction that isn't well conventional? Some of us may have more than others, but I feel like we all have at least one. And wouldn't we all feel a little bit weird if we acted against that conviction? Now, objectively, this conviction that we have may be just an opinion. But you know what I always say about opinions? Everyone has a different opinion on what's an opinion. Now, unfortunately, today we don't have Paul with us to explain every single controversy. But what I say to you this morning, brothers and sisters, is that you don't have to know or understand everything to start living faithfully today. Start with what you know. Let's take those Christians in Romans, for example. By faith, they did not eat the meat sacrificed to idols. You know why? I think it's because the Bible says to abstain from idols. So in those Christians' mind, they were wanting to stay away from anything that remotely had to do with idols. And I really don't think that's a bad thing. I truly believe that their hearts are in the right place. And as Paul was quick to point out, one can certainly still be a Christian and go their entire lives without ever eating meat sacrificed to idols. And in fact, Paul even says you don't even have to eat any meat at all to be a Christian. You can still live by faith by doing what you know, just like those Christians did. Now, James tells us in James chapter 4, verses 17, he says this, "If anyone then knows the good that they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them." So Doss knew the good that he felt led to do with the skill set that he had, which was saving lives. And Doss believed that not doing this would have been disobedience. So even when Doss was surrounded by people who disagreed with him, from his family and his fiancée, he acted on the calling that he felt like God had placed on his heart. And sometimes it feels like that for us, doesn't it? Do you ever feel like that no matter what you do, no matter what your opinion is, that people on both sides of a controversy are going to get mad at you? I know that I have before. So what's going to happen is over here, your conservative friends are going to think that you're being quite liberal, and they're going to be quite judgmental. Now, what happens quite often, too, is that your friends over here on the liberal side are going to think that you're being a conservative bigot, aren't they? Sometimes that happens on certain issues. And you know what? That's okay. And do you know why? Because the important thing to remember is that everything we do is to please and serve God. Not serve other people, but to serve God. You know why? Because it is your faith and it is your relationship with God. Doss was convicted that he did not have to be an infantryman, nor did he have to completely stay out of the war either in order to please and serve God. And you know what we saw from that story this morning? Look at all the good that he was still able to do with God at his side. Colossians 3 verses 23 through 24 says this. It says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ that you are serving. Doss knew the good he felt led to do with the skill set he had, which was saving lives, and believed that not answering that call, as I said earlier, would be disobedience. And while we're thinking about that, who was Doss's ultimate commander? Yeah, absolutely, it was God. And so what Doss did is he served in the military as if he was working for God himself, putting his heart and his faith into every single life that he had in that battlefield. Now, in my own life, I've tried to work with the same mindset. Even if it was, cleaning tanning beds or helping customers at Planet Fitness, I always did my best to serve. Now, I once had a former boss ask me, Austin, why do you work so hard at such a low-paying job? And I explained to him that I aim to treat each task as if I were working for the Lord, knowing that how much effort I put into these tasks is a reflection of my faith and my understanding of the Bible. I told him that I try to give God my best, and so therefore, I was going to give him my best too. And finally, in Galatians 1:10, it tells us this. It asks, am I trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. You see, for Doss, everything he did was to please and serve God. He felt that he was called to be a medic. His faithfulness was rooted in this desire to honor God. And I believe that is what gave him the courage to stand behind his convictions when other people misunderstood or disagreed with him. Doss had faith in this mission, even though, as you saw from the story earlier, this was more dangerous and it was more difficult than anyone else's task that day. Like Doss, our highest calling is also to serve and to please God in everything that we do. And this is whether we're making difficult decisions, this is whether we're standing on our convictions, or if we're doing simple daily tasks, we are ultimately living to honor God. This perspective can give us strength and purpose, guiding us to live each day as an act of faith. Another lesson that we can learn from Desmond Doss this morning is to respond with humility, not hostility. Point number 2 in your outline, humility, not hostility. And I believe that out of all 4 points this morning, this one is probably the one that we struggle with the most as a society, and I hate to say as a church as well. As hard as it is to resist, we should never fight fire with fire. Now, has anyone in here ever had someone say something really mean to you in real life or online? You guys have a lot of nice people in your lives. But yeah, right? We've all experienced that before, right? And so, has anyone in here ever joined a church online forum before? I joined a Church of Christ online forum once because I thought, this is exciting. I can meet brothers and sisters from around the world and we can encourage each other and we can lift each other up. Won't this be a lot of fun? Well, here's what I discovered when I went on that online forum. I had one man who said that I was going to hell. You know why? Because I didn't believe that he was Michael the Archangel. And he was real serious. He said that I was going to hell. Oh, yes. There was another Christian sister who said I was going to hell, and you know why? Because I said that when the 3,000 people on Pentecost took communion, I didn't think realistically that they all used the same cup for all 3,000 of those people. She called me a stupid devil. Her words exactly. Oh yeah, she said that I was a stupid devil. Now, was it tempting to get mad at these people? Yeah, it was. But what I did is I kept this verse in mind right behind me. Proverbs 15 verse 1, it says that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And I think that we have all seen time and time again that this is true. Now, I want to go ahead and clear something up for y'all this morning, and it's that a gentle answer doesn't mean that we avoid speaking the truth. But what it means is that when we do respond, we need to do so with grace and humility, even if the other person is being mean to us. Now, this kind of answer is unlike anything that the world is used to. It doesn't fuel anger or deepen division. You know what it does? Instead, it carries the peace of Christ, and I have seen this before, it can even diffuse tension. When we respond in this way, it's up to us to break the cycle of hostility and to open the door for understanding and reconciliation. So what I want to tell you this morning, brothers and sisters, is instead of setting fire with fire, you need to fight fire with love. As previously stated, our enemies often come from within our own circles, those that we thought were our friends and allies. And it can be tempting to justify a harsh response to someone who ought to know better, like a Christian. You know what, something that I've thought about before? I've thought to myself, well, they're in the wrong, and how I'm going to respond to them is still not nearly as mean as what they just said to me. So my response is justified. But I'm telling you this morning that based on what I'm seeing in Proverbs 15, is that fighting fire with fire will never fully heal or restore relationships. God calls us to something higher, and that is to respond in love and humility, even when it's difficult, and even when it feels like that we're the only ones who are doing so. Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 12, verses 21, he says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." You see, this verse challenges us to respond completely differently than how the world does when we face criticism, hostility, or mistreatment. And Desmond Doss experienced this firsthand, didn't he? He faced ridicule, insults, and even physical assaults from fellow soldiers, men that were supposed to be having his back on the battlefield. And this was all because that they didn't understand his faith. But in these moments, while it would have been easy for Doss to retaliate, to meet hostility with hostility, Doss chose a different path, and that is the path of humility, responding with patience and grace, even when those men didn't deserve it. Jesus says in Matthew 5:44, he says, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Doss lived out this by praying for his fellow soldiers, even after they mistreated him. And we can see from the story that that prayer bared fruit, didn't it? Because many of those same soldiers that mocked him before came to respect him deeply because of his courage and his kindness. And what this reminds me is that those who criticize us, even though it may be tempting to see them this way, but those who criticize us are not opponents to be defeated. But these are people to be loved and to be prayed for. Responding with humility and compassion reflects the heart of Christ, and it can open doors in ways that retaliation never could. Now, in my younger days, this was probably an example for people about 30 and below, but in my younger days, there were times when I wanted to unleash fire with the wrath of the Fire Lord in Avatar: The Last Airbender. I was so angry. But as I've gotten older, I've worked really, really hard not to do that. So when faced with criticism, what I've chosen to do is to try to respond with humility and grace, just like Das did, by praying for those who oppose me and responding with a gentle answer. You know what my number one piece of advice to you guys this morning who are dealing with any conflict with brothers and sisters, may it be doctrinal or personality or anything really, I want you to find something that you have in common that you've noticed, something to admire in that other person. Now, you know what I told that sister who told me that I was going to hell over the 1 cup controversy? I told her, I said, I admire your sincerity in wanting to obey God. And I believe that when we respond to people like this, it opens up the possibility of restoration. And so this is why in every conflict I believe that we can overcome evil with good if we trust that God's way is the best way to handle things. The third point this morning is shining a light through authentic faith. Shining a light through authentic faith. One thing that I've seen working with young people is that young people can tell when you're not being authentic. You know, in a lot of ways, they're really good. You know, they don't judge others from being different from them, like sometimes we can as adults. But the one thing that they do notice is that when people are being fake, they notice. And you know what one of the ways to shine a light through authentic faith is to live life like you believe the promises of God. And not just preaching the promises like I am up here, but actually believing the promises and allowing them to guide your life. Up on the screen behind me, you're going to see Desmond Doss's favorite passage of the Bible in the King James translation like he read. And it says this, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." We may be ordinary people, as I have said, but we do have an extraordinary God. And yet sometimes we, and I'm including myself in this, we forget that. We go through life as if it's all up to us. But you know what Doss's story inspired me to do when I first heard it? His story inspired me to start living as if I truly believe this verse. Like I truly believe that God will be with me. I don't think it's that Doss went into the battle with no fear. I don't think he was completely fearless. But you know what I think it is? I think that he decided to fear God more than he feared evil. He placed his trust in God's presence, which allowed him to walk into one of the most terrifying situations that any of us could imagine without hesitation. A little bit of a personal story about me. I feel like I have personally grown a lot in about a year and a half time, especially for those like up here in the front row who knew me before I came to Florida. And I think a very large part of that, I would say probably the largest part of that, of how I've grown so much, is I committed myself to start believing the promises of God, like the promise that God is always with me. You see, growing up in church, I always knew these promises intellectually. It's not that I didn't know the promises of God, but I didn't feel the promises of God. Does that make any sense? I knew them, but I didn't feel them. But what I did is that my heart was hard, and I didn't let the promises of God cut deep into my heart. But once I started allowing the Word of God to soften my heart, did I still struggle like everyone else? Yeah, of course I did. But I'm telling you that life's burdens, once I started believing in the promises of God, no longer seem as heavy as they once did. Truly believing these promises has changed everything for me. And I believe that it can change you too. One thing that Desmond Doss's story has taught me is that the way you live your life is the loudest sermon you'll ever preach. Now, I could stand up here and I could preach all morning long. Don't worry, I won't, but I'm just saying I could. You know? I could stand up here and I could preach all day long that I believe in the promises of Psalm and I believe that God is walking with me. But you know what's more important than me standing up here preaching it for my life? It's more important that I live my life like I truly believe that promise in Psalms. In other words, we are to conduct ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel, as if the gospel is the truest story that has ever been told, and that all the promises that it entails are true. I believe that Desmond Doss embodied this attitude in every way. Although he initially faced criticism from fellow soldiers, it was his actions on the battlefield, rescuing soldier after soldier, often in the face of extreme danger, that demonstrated that his faith was not one that was just spoken, but he lived out the calling that he felt in his heart. As James put it in James chapter 2, verse 17, he says, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. Like Doss, we're called to live out our faith authentically, to let our actions reflect God's love. Let me give you a couple examples. If God is a God who saves, what ought we to do? We ought to save. And if God is a God who comforts, what ought we to do? Well, we ought to comfort. Now, Doss's fellow soldiers accused him of doing wrong at first, didn't they? But they eventually came to respect him so much that, and this is one of the craziest parts of the story for me, they went from making fun of his faith to asking him to lead their prayers before they went out to battle. And it reminds me of what Peter said up here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. He says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. So what Doss was able to do through his example, his living faith, his actions, it turned opposition into admiration. And it shows us that an act of faith can impact others profoundly, even in ways that we cannot see it. I believe that Jesus, of course, puts it best in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, where he says, let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify who? Not glorify me or you, to glorify your Father in heaven. You know, there are times when we may feel like our light goes unnoticed, especially if we're not in a prominent role. Has anyone ever felt that way? You feel like you're doing your best to serve and to love God, and it just feels like, what difference am I making? Is anyone even noticing? Well, let me tell you something this morning. That even when it doesn't seem obvious, if you are a child of God, if you have the Spirit living inside of you, or if you are walking with Him daily, I can promise you right now that your light is shining and more people are noticing than you could ever know. When I decided to move to Florida to become a youth minister, my brother gave me an autograph book for all my friends and family to sign. And as I read page after page of kind words that people had written, I was truly humbled to see how many people were touched by the light that God was shining through me. You see, I thought that since I wasn't a big shot, that my light wasn't very noticeable. But I'm telling you this morning that could not be further from the truth. And that could not be further from the truth for you today too. Remember what I was telling the kids this morning who our number one enemy is? Our number one enemy is Satan, and he is the father of lies. And one of the lies that Satan loves to tell us is to tell us that our impact doesn't matter. To tell us that no one can see God's light shining through us. Telling us that anything that we do for God's glory falls unnoticed on both God and man. But I'm telling you that this is a lie from Satan. For if our light shines for God's glory, people cannot help but notice. And this is whether they share our faith or not. You know, it's one thing I'll never forget in the book that my brother got me. I had a friend, and this is a very close friend of mine who's not a Christian, but he told me how much he admired my kindness and dedication to others. And you know what he wrote in my book? He said, "Your pure light makes me happy and proud of you for serving God." Hearing that from someone like him, I mean someone who doesn't even share my faith, someone who doesn't even believe in God, or is very much struggling to. But that was just such a moving moment for me. And you know what it showed me? It showed me that when we live authentically for Christ, people will notice. Even those who may not believe as we do. And that is the power of a genuine light, brothers and sisters. A genuine light reaches people in ways that we may not even realize. And it's like that verse set up there with Jesus. There are probably some people who are glorifying God, and the reason why they haven't told us is because they're too busy glorifying God. And what I want you to do this morning is to kind of think a little bit about someone in your life who may be watching the way that you live. And I'm telling you, once you kind of start thinking about it, you're never going to know the impact that you could have. And another thing this morning that I want to challenge everyone in here to do. So, you know those people that I mentioned earlier who felt like maybe they're a little discouraged that no one's noticing God's light shining through them? I want you to think of someone in your life who could use encouragement today, just like the people did for me in that autograph book. I want you to think of someone whose light shines in a way that brings glory to God, even if they may not see it themselves. And I want you to take a moment and tell them that you see God's light shining through them and that it brings glory to God. Desmond Doss's story is remembered for this humble yet profound prayer. Lord, help me save one more. He knew that he could not do it on his own, I believe, didn't he? Because notice who he asked to help him. He said, Lord, help me save one more. And Doss knew that each and every life he saved was due to the grace of God. As was read for you this morning, Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 through 24 says this, "For to me," this is Paul talking, he says, "For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I don't know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." Now, on the battlefield that night, Doss knew that any moment could be his last. Now, on the one hand, what better way to leave the world than serving the Lord? Amen? And if that had been his faith, I have no doubt that Doss would have accepted that as God's will. But instead of focusing on his own safety, remember what he said in the prayer? He pleaded with God to give him just one more chance to save one more soul. And then once he saved that life, he prayed the exact same prayer again, didn't he? He prayed again for one more. Doss took his mission one soul at a time, showing us that true service is lived out in small and faithful steps. Like Paul, Doss seemed to understand that every moment he remained on earth was an opportunity to serve others. He didn't look too far ahead. He focused on the present, on each life he could save. And I believe that this one more soul approach challenges us to view our own lives through a similar lens. We may think that our lives are totally different from Doss's, right? You know, we're not facing gunfire and mortar shells and such. We may look at that story as something that happened about 80 years ago in a faraway land that has nothing to do with us. But let me tell you something this morning. In many ways, we are in the same position as Doss. None of us know how long we have left on this earth. But while we are here, each day is an opportunity to reach one more for Christ, making the most of every moment. What I want to tell you this morning is that when you feel like giving up, I want you to keep going. When you are surrounded by hate, I want you to keep loving. And when you see hurt around you, I want you to keep reaching out. Doss's prayer of one more also reflects Jesus' commission of the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says, "Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations." Now, there's an old preacher's joke that says, "Go ye" means go me. A more accurate translation would actually be "go ye" means go y'all. Or as Jan put it, if you're really Southern, "go ye" means go all y'all. But regardless of how you word it, I think the point is the same. That our mission is to go out and to make disciples of all the nations. Now, this mission that Jesus gave us, it doesn't have to be about these big gestures. Now, it can be. And I'm very thankful for people who do the big gestures, of course, like going to foreign fields. But you know what this commission is also about? It's also about everyday faithfulness and reaching others. Shining our light, like I mentioned earlier. Just as Doss took it one person at a time in that battlefield, we too can make an impact and open doors to other people hearing about the gospel through small acts of love and kindness, such as a simple smile to someone, a listening ear, a word of encouragement. And as I discovered when I read through that book, these can reach further than we may ever know. We need to start trusting that God can use every encounter, no matter how small, for His kingdom. Our final point this morning is that sacrificial love is at the heart of our faith. As read for you this morning, John chapter 15, verse 13 captures the love behind Doss's actions, where it says, "No greater love has anyone than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." And this is true of all the men and women, including those in our very own congregation who have served in one of our 6 armed forces. They have demonstrated the ultimate sacrifice of being willing to lay down their life for others. And may that also be true for us today in the Lord's army. May we be like Jesus, like Doss, willing to lay down our lives, our comfort, and our desires to love and serve one another with a heart of humility and courage. Now, my challenge to you this morning, brothers and sisters, is who is the one more person in your life? Who is the one more person in your life that God may be calling you to reach out? This could be a family member. It could be a friend. Could be a stranger. I don't know who that person is. It could be someone that you encounter on your daily routine, like maybe you stop at the same place for coffee every day. Or the person that checks you in when you go into the gym in the morning, like at Planet Fitness. But like Doss, let's make it our prayer to make it, please, Lord, help me get one more. And if we focus on these small steps, one person at a time, I believe that God will help us if we pray it sincerely. Now, for me, that one more person in my life was a friend of mine. I once worked at a Christian camp. Surprising, I know, me working at a Christian camp. But I once worked at a Christian camp. And did you know there was a really good friend of mine who was struggling with suicidal thoughts at the time? Now, I didn't know that at the time. I could tell that he was a little down. So what I did is I got a little piece of paper out and I got a pen and I just wrote him a real simple note. And you know what I wrote? I wrote, I am so glad that you are here. And what he told me later is he said that I will never fully know or understand how much that note was encouraging to him. So I say once more, let's adopt Doss's prayer as our own. Each day, let's ask God to use us just to reach one more person with His love. Whether that's through a word of encouragement, an act of kindness, or sharing of our faith, we can make a difference one soul at a time. May we live each day with a one more mindset, remaining here on earth not for our own sake only, but also to serve and to glorify God. And this morning, our invitation is quite simple. If you are already a member of the Lord's army, but you've been feeling a little depressed or perhaps discouraged, or maybe there's a sin that you would like to share to confess for the congregation, we can pray for you this morning for sure. Now, if you're someone who has never heard the gospel story, like you've been listening to me this morning and you're like, okay, God, Jesus, I'm interested. I want to know more. We would love to share the gospel story with you this morning. Now, if you're someone who's already heard the gospel story and you believe the gospel story and you're ready to put Christ on in baptism this morning, well, we can do that for you too as we stand for our invitational song.